Good morning, and welcome to this first plenary session of this conference, Asia Future Summit. As you know, this is in commemoration of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's 100th birth anniversary. And just this morning at the first session, we had a discussion by Senior Minister Theo, Chee. Although this is the 100th birth anniversary conference of Lee Kuan Yew, I know Mr. Lee Kuan Yew would not have wanted us to spend the whole conference going over Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's thoughts. That's not just him at all. As Senior Minister Theo said, you know, he wouldn't have wanted that, but he wants us to distill the principles and think about the future, go beyond what he has done. But of course, the concerns for Singapore are always the same. I've worked with Mr. Lee, and I thought I'll share a snippet with you because that tells you the sort of person he is, and which is why I say he would not want us to just go over Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's thoughts. You know, he was asked by some journalists once what he thought of himself as this world statesman. How did he react to statements such as that? And he said, statesman, I'm not a statesman. I just work hard, I'm consistent, and I'm persistent. I want to get things done. That is all. Then he added, and anyone who thinks he's a statesman should see a psychiatrist. So with that, you know, I thought that would be a good icebreaker, but tell you something about the man. Our session this morning is, you know, geopolitics, finding the balance amid geopolitical tensions. Now, we have watched the US-China relationship transform from engagement to competition to confrontation. We saw this when China became a rising power, became more active on the global stage, and in fact, assertive in the region. And the United States started recalibrating and reworking its response. Now, there have been ups and downs in the Chinese relationship, but we've never seen a period such as this. The quality and the tone of the relationship has changed completely. We spent the last 6 years, you know, I say 6 years because I think it started really quite seriously in 2018, although it was slowly baking even before then. In the last 6 years, we've been wondering, where is this, what's happening? Where is this going? And how will it end? President Trump launched a tariff war, which soon became a trade war, then an investment war, then a technology war. When President Biden was elected, the policy didn't change. In fact, he doubled down on policy. And he became more systematic, and because the Biden administration is more organized and disciplined, the effects were felt even greater. The Trump administration, in fact, tried to redefine and reposition the US relationship with Taiwan, following interpreting the 3 communiques in the way they wanted to. And the Biden administration, I think, has continued this too. But the Biden administration has, in fact, gone further because he's been able, President Biden, to gather his allies and shown American leadership with the Ukraine war, and gathered NATO allies and Europe and allies in Asia. China, of course, sees this as the containment of China. The United States and the allies see this as developing strategic deterrence. But China says, This is containment. And on Taiwan, I think both sides have shifted policy on the ground. And the Pelosi visit drew a new level of response from China. And what is dangerous for this region is that both sides are now normalizing this policy response. However, there's some good news. Recently, we've seen some moves on the part of the United States to try to reach out to China to stabilize the relationship. The question is this strategic or is this tactical? Now, to discuss the development of this relationship, where we are at, we have two excellent speakers this morning. We have Ambassador John Huntsman from the United States. John, who has served in government, US government, as a deputy USTR, in politics as the elected governor of Utah, and in diplomacy as the ambassador to Singapore, where he started, and then to ambassador to China and ambassador to Russia. He's certainly the right person to speak on this topic. We also have Professor Qingguo, who is a professor at Peking University, and the former dean of the School of International Studies. He's also a member of the Standing Committee of the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th National Committee of the CPPCC. So with these two excellent speakers, I do not want to take up more time. I'm going to hand the floor to Ambassador John Huntsman first. He will have about 12 minutes. Maybe he'll go to 15, but I'm going to cut it off if he exceeds that. And then the floor is for Professor Jia. I'll then ask a couple of questions, and I'll hand over the session to you. John?
Heng, Chee, terima kasih. Thank you so much. 我们讲中文或是讲英文？
英文吧。
半门农夫，请多指教。I'm truly honored and delighted to be here in this remarkable country from which I've learned so much, whose leaders have taught me and instructed me over the years in ways that I will never forget. And so it is indeed an honor, Heng Chee, to be with you and so many others, and so many friends in the audience who I'm increasingly identifying as I look around the ballroom. I'm honored to be here with Mary Kay, who's taken this journey with me, and to be here with the esteemed Professor Qingguo. It's a pleasure to be with you, sir. Thank you so very much. I have just a few framing remarks that maybe will set the stage for some of what we will talk about through the course of the next hour. But let me just start by saying that Singapore really is an indispensable friend and a partner and a global leader in so many ways. Lee Kuan Yew, Li Guangyao, built pragmatic ideals into every one of the 600 square miles that make up this extraordinary city-state. I was fortunate to consider him a good friend whose sound advice I very much cherished, whether beginning my role as U.S. ambassador to China or inspiring my economic development strategy as a newly elected governor of the state of Utah in the United States. I had to confess at one point, however, that I stole his intellectual property in developing my own EDB prototype in the state of Utah that took our state to #1 in economic performance in the United States of America, for which I owed Lee Kuan Yew a great deal. As he used to tell me, If you're not attracting brain power and capital, you will become second-rate. Those words have always been present in my mind. Now, my time in Singapore, as Heng Chee noted, as ambassador in the early 1990s, was marked by a rapidly evolving unipolar world. Communism in Europe collapsed without much warning, leading me to conclude that the most profound shifts in global order were sometimes jolting, unexpected, and yes, sometimes even relatively peaceful. There was talk of a peace dividend, along with hyperbolic discussion about even the end of history. But Lee Kuan Yew taught me that history never ends or even stays static, but grinds away based on culture, geography, values, and national interests. Thousand-year-old civilizations don't just disappear. They have survival instincts and must remake themselves in order to stay relevant. He would say America has the formula for success: rule of law, a relevant constitution, and impenetrable borders, the Pacific and the Atlantic, which any major country would give everything for. But he would go on to say, but you are young, and you will be tested. And tested we have been in the 8 years following his passing. We are now experiencing and seeing a world of fragmentation, seemingly between easily defined orders, characterized by great power rivalry. A world even of contradictions, people living better, longer, healthier, more prosperous lives, yet conflict, inequality, and risk are higher than any time in the post-war period. We're more connected by trade and financial flows, technology and travel, yet are increasingly fractured politically. Technology advances are far outpacing government's ability to develop rules of the road, creating uncertainty everywhere. While the risk of direct great power conflict still appears manageable, new forms of conflict abound, some invisible, and not even associated with traditional state actors, even while state actors have been influenced by streaks of authoritarianism, neo-populism, and muscular nationalism as a form of legitimacy. Perhaps most concerning to me is a movement away from, and in some cases, desire to dismiss gains made from decades of open global economic activity. And as a result, the increasing reluctance to address critical issues through the give and take that diplomacy requires. Now, managing risk in an unmoored world, therefore, becomes a challenge of our times. Are we up to the task? I think so. Or maybe I don't want to accept the alternative. In fact, governments everywhere are restructuring their economic and political relationships to address perceived risks, with more emphasis on security concerns and on worst-case scenario planning. This, of course, also brings changes to the economic order, including how businesses interact, where they choose to invest, and how supply chains are structured. In short, de-risking and economic security will be central aspects of policymaking, both within business and government, through the foreseeable future. But above all, people will look to the overall state of the U.S.-China relationship. In a world where the global system matters, as it does to all of us here, the U.S. and China remain the key relationship in the world. If the U.S. and China find themselves in a serious conflict, every country in the world would have to choose sides. This would be a catastrophe. Both sides are now moving into a more confrontational posture. So the questions for all of us become, how do we move from where we are today to where we should be? If we want cooperation, what does that actually look like beyond just sound bites back and forth across the Pacific? How do we remove grievances on each side in order to find more common ground? In achieving all of this, I'm convinced that three areas will be key for all of us to focus on. A relationship that is based on, number one, mutual respect. Number two, mutual coexistence. And number three, avoidance of conflict. You see, my friends, the stakes are high, but the price of failure is even higher. Thank you very much, Heng Chee.
Thank you, John. You've left me a lot of room to ask you questions later, but Professor Jia.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chen, and it's a great honor to share this panel with Ambassador Huntsman and two great ambassadors. Today we celebrate the Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's centennial birthday. Mr. Lee is a towering historical figure and one of his many fans. As the founding leader of Singapore, he accomplished much in his long political career. In part because of his leadership, politically, Singapore has developed a stable, self-disciplined, and responsible government. Economically, Singapore has developed a dynamic, free, and efficient market. Militarily, Singapore has developed a strong military and friendly relations with its neighbors. And socially, Singapore has developed a system that attains a level of social equality and harmony admired by many in the world. As a result, Singapore has thrived and become an important voice for the good in world affairs. If there is a state that can punch well beyond its weight, it's Singapore. Now let's return to the dull subject of China-US relations. At the moment, the relationship appears to be stabilizing. In the last couple of months, actually, after a number of years of bickering and confrontation, we have seen quite a few high-level visits and meetings between cabinet officials of the two countries. And also, the two governments have established working groups to deal with issues, economic issues and other issues. Even the two militaries finally found a way to meet each other. Why has the relationship developed this way? Can we afford to be more optimistic about the future? There are many reasons for the current re-engagement. However, two developments last year probably have the most direct impact on this development. The first is the US midterm election. The second is China's 20th Party Congress. The US midterm election led to the loss of control of the House by the Democrats. That was bad news for Biden if he wants to get new legislations to pass the Congress. However, it's good news for China-US relationship because it offers new opportunities for him to adjust or readjust US-China policy. When he came to power, during the first 2 years, he could not do it because his priority was domestic. If he wanted to get anything done, whether to control the pandemic or to restore the economy or to build infrastructure, he needed the Congress. But the Congress was in a bad mood on China. Every vote counted, since the Democrats only had a slim majority there. So he had to be tough on China. Now, he cannot pass legislation or important ones anyway. The value of congressional votes has depreciated. Now he can do more on China. Of course, he has a lot of different views as to how to deal with China, from Donald Trump. It's now put them into practice. Engagement is better than confrontation for Biden, among other things. The 20th Party Congress in China saw the placement of new leaders. After they are successfully put into place, they have to deliver. And in order to deliver, you have to address the current challenges in China. The biggest challenge in China at the moment, appears to me, and probably also to our leaders, is the economy. How to restore the economic growth that has been hampered by the pandemic and also other issues. To do that, you need to do things both at home and overseas. At home, China instituted a lot of policies to stimulate the economy, including policies on the real estate properties, stock market, and also to encourage the private entrepreneurship. Overseas, you need to create a stable international environment. And key to that is to stabilize China-US relations. So when the two developments combined, you see a new opportunity, a window of opportunity for stabilizing the relationship, if not improvement of the relationship. That to some extent helps us to understand why they are meeting and talking to each other and engaging in long and serious dialogues in recent months. What's the future prospect of the relationship? My hunch is that in the immediate future, I think the current efforts to stabilize the relationship, to re-engage, is going to continue, but it's going to be hesitant and probably slower than people would like them to be. Okay. But then the window of opportunity is going to be very short. Okay. By next March, the US presidential election would be in full steam. Okay. If history can tell us anything, whenever you have a presidential election, the candidates would compete on getting tough on China. Okay. Biden probably would return to the old course of being tough on China. So the prospect is not good. Also, after the several years of confrontation, the two sides have too little trust in each other. And caught between domestic political pressures and possibility of being taken advantage by the other side, each side finds it necessary to be very cautious in taking actions. As a result, the efforts to re-establish contacts have been hesitant and easily disrupted by various events, as demonstrated by the balloon incident. And finally, even if they can overcome the suspicion and move quickly, given the nature of the relationship now, there are limits as to how much they can accomplish in shaping the relationship in a more positive direction. China and the US have been moving away from each other in the past decades, both economically and politically. This is unlikely to change in the immediate future. Hence, there is little chance for the relationship to return to the Obama days. The best one can hope is that the two countries will find a way to coexist peacefully and engage with each other in a limited way. What about the relationship in the longer run? I don't know, that's everybody's guess. But I think one should not be too pessimistic. The two countries have a lot of stakes and also a lot of interests in common. Okay. And also, they are not diametrically opposed, even in terms of values. In China, we have 24 character core national values, okay, which include democracy, rule of law, freedom, and equality. And so we're not that diametrically opposed at the level of ideas. Of course, we practice these values differently because of different national conditions. But in the longer run, I think if we behave rationally, we'll find it necessary not only to coexist peacefully, but also to work together to promote our shared interests, as well as the common goods of the world. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jia. I think you would have noticed both speakers have been very careful in how they talk about the relationship. Maybe they're very careful that they should not upset the stabilization that is being attempted now. Don't make mistakes, don't add fuel to fire, and let the relationship go forward. But there are 2 points I would like to take up. Qingguo has indicated that he's not that optimistic about the US-China relationship going forward, but one has to be optimistic. So it's low expectations, okay? John, I'm going to ask you, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the trajectory of the US-China relationship? That's the first question. And the second part to it, that is the presidential elections next year. You know, I think the rhetoric will go quite intense and somewhat wild. Each one, different parties are trying to be tougher on China. How do you think US and China, the responsible parties who want the relationship to go forward, can insulate themselves somewhat from the kind of campaign rhetoric? So optimistic or pessimistic? And secondly, how do you deal with the presidential elections next year and contain the rhetoric?
Thank you, Heng Chee. First of all, to your point about us being too cautious, you should remember that as diplomats, you're supposed to say something when there's nothing to say, and say nothing when there's something to say. You're always caught between a cliche and an indiscretion. That's where you find yourself. But these are very real issues, and at this point, I think we need to do a better job understanding the political constraints and realities on each side. And I don't think we've ever done a very good job in doing that. Part of it is because the United States is a country with the Atlantic and Pacific on either side. We have a large domestic marketplace. We don't venture out as much as maybe people in other countries. And maybe we're even less curious about topics that are playing out in major countries of the world. But we've reached a point where in order to maintain global stability, even equilibrium, if I could put it that way, we owe it to each other to better understand the political constraints inherent in each system and to try to work around those. I'll never forget in one negotiating session I had in Beijing where Wang Qishan was present. And at the time, he was serving in a very senior position, maybe vice president. And he called a small group of us out to the courtyard in the middle of a break because we were at an impasse. And our side was saying, we can only go so far because Congress won't accept anything beyond this or beyond that, which is a typical American negotiating approach. And Wang Qishan took us out to the courtyard and looked at us and said to me, he said, 洪大使，你不太了解，我们中国也有政治。
In the US, we do have politics.
Going on our side. You see, in China, we have politics too. And I think with the rise of Xi Jinping and sort of the unifocus around ideology, we forget that in the past, maybe less so today, but in the past, certainly there have been factions, certainly there have been robust debates within the system that many on the American side don't understand. So I think the first order of business as we step back from the abyss, if I could use that term, is to understand what are the political constraints in each political system. And let's not pretend that they don't exist. So Congress for the United States is very real. It's elected by the people. It's a loud, transparent, boisterous, seemingly chaotic structure, evidenced by what we've seen just in the last day or so with the Speaker of the House stepping down, having been voted out. My friends here in Asia say, we just don't understand how the American system functions. Can you explain? And I say, well, that would take a very long time. Suffice it to say, there's constant churning in American democracy. And part of it is a function of our active civil society, the give and take of our debates, and the strength of our Constitution. But what a lot of people in China don't fully understand is that Washington is not the place to look in understanding the health and the well-being of the United States of America. Most of the important work in our country takes place in the individual states. We have 50 of them. And they're all individual sovereign entities with their own constitution, their own legislature, their own civil society, and their own ability to opine on the issues. And they all differ. And it's a mishmash of competing laboratories of democracy. To the outside world, it looks chaotic. and sometimes can even be frustrating when it comes to easy and quick resolution of important issues of the day. But we do move forward, and we do make things happen, and we do attract capital, and we do attract brain power on an ongoing basis, and we create new industries and new technologies without people even forecasting their arrival, and we remake the global economy decade after decade after decade. And it's due to the input of people who come to the United States from all over the world. And they participate in this great ongoing experiment that in America we have to work hard every generation to preserve. And on the Chinese side, we need to do a better job understanding the constraints within the Chinese system. And by doing so, I think we can begin to identify areas of common ground. Do our people do well together? Yes, our people do well together. We've had hundreds of thousands of students who have attended our best universities in the United States. I've seen them in the streets of every major city in America. And I talk to them when I see them. And I ask them where they're from and a little bit about them. And we always enjoy those encounters. And our businesses do well together. And we've had a lot of interaction in a relationship that started with the ping pong ball. A small ping pong ball brought about the most important relationship that we have in the world today, and it's growing ever large and ever complicated. And in order to get to a level of stability without our talking back and forth past one another, but rather with one another, in achieving respect, in achieving coexistence, and even long-term peace, is the ability to understand the constraints. And then I think we should have expectations that are realistic. Sometimes because our relationship has been so supercharged, and in many cases quite positive over the last couple of decades, we tend to view the relationship as being too capable of big and ambitious things. And in the past, we have been capable of big and ambitious things. In today's world, I think we have to moderate that just a little bit. And we should be careful about the expectations that we build for one another in a respectful environment. And we should begin with the fundamental building blocks of almost reintroducing ourselves, coming to grips with what we need to do as a baseline level of communication to ensure that there's no outbreak of conflict. In the past, we've not done a very good job of this. We have hotlines, but the hotlines typically don't work during a time of tension. So I think we get back to the basics and we form an agenda that is realistic based upon the political constraints of each side, understanding full well that when the United States has elections, which we do every 2 years, and presidential elections every 4 years, that there's going to be a lot of talk about the future. And sometimes politicians, when they get on stage, they talk about things that others don't necessarily agree with. And I understand that. By the same token, every 5 years we have party congresses. And sometimes in party congresses there are factions that say things about the United States and about the West that are interpreted on my side of the Pacific as less than desirable and very much aggressive and conflict-based. So let's just conclude that politics will be politics, and people will say things that oftentimes will not be relevant in the end of our discussion. So Professor Jia and I could sit here together. We could spend the next 24 hours coming up with a template for coexistence during the next decade. I have every confidence we could do that, devoid of politics. And then when we include the politics on my side and the politics, of course, on Professor Jia's side, things become a little bit complicated, and we must be realistic about that. So start small, start realistically, understand the constraints inherent on both sides, but also understand that the agenda matters. There's an ebb and flow of each year based upon election cycles, based upon party congresses, based upon months of time and space where we can have bilateral visits without the constraints of politics, where perhaps we can make progress. And I'll just end with this thought, because when I sat in Beijing as a United States ambassador, I was always mindful of the calendar. What's coming up in 3 months? What's coming up in 6 months? What do we have a year from now? And where do we have an opening where we can actually sit down free and clear of some political constraints and talk about the fundamentals of the relationship and how we might make those progress? Unfortunately, we have long-term thinking and strategy making against short-term thinking on the United States side that is made more complicated by the election cycles. That won't change. That's inherent to the American political system. In some cases, it's a beautiful thing because it creates innovation and constant churning. On the other hand, it makes it difficult for the United States to maintain a consistent, uninterrupted strategy as we move forward. And I would cite that as one of the constraints that we have to operate with.
Professor Jia, my question to you, following, much in the same vein, is how will China react to the rhetoric of presidential elections? Is the government in Beijing now used to seeing this cycle and the extremes of rhetoric go on, and you take it with a pinch of salt, or you say actually they could implement some of those policies? So that's the first question. How do you think Beijing will react to the rhetoric, and do you have any idea how you can put in a mechanism to try to stop the relationship from sliding because of the reaction to the elections and carry on?
Well, that's a tough question. First of all, I think we take the rhetoric quite seriously for various reasons. The first reason is once it's said, it has a policy impact, right? Especially a campaign promise. If you make a campaign promise, you have to do something, even for political purposes, symbolically. That, of course, creates a problem for the relationship. Secondly, as Ambassador Huntsman put it, we have politics too. Our people are going to be very upset. They push the Chinese government to take a tough position on the U.S. And also, probably over time, when the rhetoric is repeated again and again, people get the sense that the true intention of the U.S., of the Americans. Okay. For example, one of the sayings a few years ago was, the U.S. does not only want money from China, it wants our life. If it's a question of life, then there is no room for compromise, right? So this is how people get the intention, or get to know the intention of the U.S. Of course, we know, as specialists of the U.S., that a lot of campaign promises cannot be delivered. For running the office, but most people do not know. And some leaders probably are not aware of this complicated U.S. process. So we have a problem there. How to overcome this? I think, well, first of all, we should study the U.S. more. about its politics. After all, U.S. is a very important country. Whatever it does affects our country's interests. Okay? Be more relaxed. If you understand U.S. politics more, you can afford to be more relaxed about the policy implications of certain campaign promises. And second, to take a more pragmatic approach in dealing with each other, especially to work together on concrete issues on which clearly we have shared interests and stakes. Okay? And build trust on the successful dealing with such kind of concrete issues and engage in more cooperation over time. And of course, finally, I think we should be more forthcoming to inform our public about what country U.S. is, both the negative part and also the positive sides, okay, about U.S. politics, and of course to alleviate some of the pressures from the society on this relationship. And of course, we should also encourage the U.S. government to do the same, to educate Americans about China in a more objective way. Okay? I don't know, it's maybe too much challenge for our leaders to do that, but something, however challenging, you have to do.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to see if there are questions from the floor. I see Paul's hand. Paul Henley. Please, a mic.
Thank you, Heng Chee. Thank you to both of you for your outstanding comments. It's good to see you, Ambassador Huntsman, Professor Jia. Despite the intensifying competition and rivalry, antagonism, the two sides recently have managed to get reconnected at a high level. Pushed, I think, by the United States, sending cabinet secretaries from state, commerce, treasury, the climate czar to China. There's indications that the vice premier, He Lifeng, and maybe the foreign minister, Wang Yi, may travel to the United States. This is all positive in my view, and I think welcomed by the region. The one high-level dialogue that's not back up and running is the military-to-military dialogue, which was suspended by the Chinese side after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year. That's of major concern here in the region. And so my first question to Professor Jia is, what would it take on the Chinese side to get the military-to-military dialogue back up and running? Maybe you can give us a sense of, we've been talking a lot about domestic politics in China and in the U.S. What are some of the domestic politics on that issue in China that make it difficult to get that back up and running? And then for Ambassador Huntsman, you mentioned three very important principles, and the last one was to avoid conflict. We don't have the buffers and stabilizers and guardrails in the relationship. I think that would be critical to be able to do that. If we can get mill-to-mill back up and running, what work do the two sides need to do to put those kind of protocols and structures in place so that we can raise the potential that we can manage to avoid conflict? Thank you.
Thank you.
You first. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for your question. What would it take for the senior military personnel to meet each other? Well, first of all, I think the sanctions should be lifted against our defense minister. He got the sanction because he was serving his former position, in his former position. So that to some extent explains why they could not meet in the Shangri-La dialogue. Of course, to create a better atmosphere, I think probably the U.S. should reduce its military operations in the South China Sea and also in the near the Taiwan Strait. And one of the things I can think of is to send a senior delegation to the Xiangshan Dialogue. That would be helpful because, that probably would prompt the Chinese leaders, military leaders, to meet the delegation. So it should be a good start. So there are many ways for many things that can be done to resume high-level military contacts between the two countries. Thank you.
Yeah. John?
Paul, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for your good service over the years in so many different ways and contributing to the well-being of the region. Let me just say somewhat categorically that it's been a very long time since the people of the United States and the people of China have seen anything good come out of the bilateral relationship. So in the early days, there was a sense of innocence, nothing we couldn't do. We could attend each other's universities, we could build businesses together, we could exchange technology. And now we find ourselves in a much different state for reasons that everyone in this room fully understands, that perhaps was inevitable given the rise in growth in China and the sense in the United States that we've never been here before. Ergo, what do we do? But the military piece is an important one. And we have to get beyond the, well, Minister so-and-so did not take my call and was not willing to meet when we were last in Singapore. I was with Secretary Austin just a couple of weeks ago, and I heard him say that very thing, that I would be willing to meet, but I have not been granted a meeting. Now we know that Minister Li Shangfu is gone, and maybe there's an opportunity to start something new. But I think we have to be realistic on the military-to-military side, because when a bilateral relationship as large and complex as ours is managed first and foremost by the security and military professionals, we can all predict where that goes, because they're paid to plan and exercise and think differently than traditional diplomats. But this remains a barrier, and we must recognize this on both sides, because we become calcified in the Pentagon, in the national security establishment in the United States, and their similar counterparts in Beijing. This is almost predictable, because this is what countries do. They plan on contingencies toward one another. So how do we get out of this? I think, first of all, we have to recognize that the years ahead are going to be choppy. They're not going to be easy. We should not be delusional about that. And if our first order of business is to avoid conflict, which it should be, because that alone would be catastrophic for the world, if you just do the economic analysis to see what even a gray zone conflict would do for the economies of the United States, China, certainly, Europe, Korea, Japan, even India. I mean, if you start looking at the trade flows and the blockage in the East China Sea and beyond in countries that are import dependent, it becomes rather catastrophic. So let's begin to take that off the table and speak realistically. Well, Taiwan emerges pretty quickly as an issue that we have to talk about, as opposed to at each other, beyond each other, across the Pacific, but rather at a common table with a sense of understanding, history, and respect. The chances are we're not going to get anywhere, no real answers, and that's to be expected. But I think the idea that we could somehow preserve a status quo similar to the '92 consensus that was developed right here between Wang Daohan and Gu Zhengfu, is not unrealistic, but it's in that status quo, which should never be just a status quo because that's wasted effort. But what do we do in that status quo to begin to build confidence in the security environment? And ultimately, how do we resolve some of these issues that might not even be resolved during our lifetime? But that discussion must take place. So I think being realistic about where we both are on Taiwan is something that we have to be honest about. Number two, and an area that could be helpful and maybe even yield some productive results. And again, I say this in the spirit of when I started my comment, which is it's been so long since we've seen anything productive come out of the bilateral relationship. I think in order to address the trust gap, the trust deficit, the waning views on both sides toward the other, so they become rather calcified, not just among the government security apparatchiks, but among the people, which is, to me, one of the most dangerous signs, is the view of people in the United States toward China, the view of people in China toward the United States. This is a structural problem. This is not something you just kind of release at the negotiating table by coming up with a temporary compromise. This is something that has to be addressed, and it's going to be a long-term effort, but it has to be rebuilt. But there is an area that I think, Paul, could be really important, and that's a discussion on strategic stability, something we've never done, on proliferation, which is an issue that I know China feels strongly about, and certainly the United States feels strongly about that. So as China ramps up its strategic forces, and as they get better, and there's less of a sense of transparency around it, beginning and forging a discussion around strategic stability, as difficult as that might be, I think would be a very important signal to both sides that we are looking at what could be the most catastrophic element of a sour relationship, and we're doing something about it. Even some very elementary steps. Now, China has said, well, we don't really need to have this conversation until we reach parity. You're in the thousands of strategic weapons, and we're in the hundreds, but moving fast. I think that this would be an area where we're creative enough on both sides, where we should be able to come up with some sense of dialogue around strategic stability, and the reason it's important from my standpoint as an American is it would send the right kind of signal to the United States that we're actually serious about an element of military and strategic growth that could be profoundly dangerous over time that both sides actually care about. And I think that would translate very positively in the minds of people on both sides. So I'm thinking in terms of, okay, how do we begin delivering something that both sides begin to see as valuable? Okay, we're not just talking past one another, we're actually looking at something that's important in my life in Salt Lake City, Utah, or Chicago, Illinois. This was something that I know during, and I don't want to say that we're in or entering a Cold War. I think that's the wrong frame for what we're talking about here. But it was a very important part of our discussions over the decades with Russia, with the old Soviet Union. And I think it's something that could build confidence if we were to approach it the right way in this bilateral context.
Thank you. Yes, Prime Minister Howard.
Madam, my question is directed to
The mic will come to you. Yeah?
Yeah. Thank you. My question is either or both. Given that it would have been believed in Beijing and Moscow that the special military operation in Ukraine would have been implemented more speedily and with greater success, is it a fact that, notwithstanding anything that is now said, Beijing would be taking pause to think, gee, any kind of takeover or attempted takeover of Taiwan might result in a decade or more of trying to subjugate a rebellious and recalcitrant promise and might well be recasting the whole military outlook towards Taiwan and reinforce what I think is an imperative for America and her allies to lower the temperature on Taiwan and discourage people visiting the province for domestic political reasons.
Thank you. You both, I think. I would start with Qingguo.
Okay, thank you.
Taiwan, yeah? And Ukraine.
I think it's unfair to compare the two kinds of situations. Ukraine is a different country. It's legally recognized. And of course, Russia has its own grievances, but then by international law, Ukraine and including the republics that are supposed to be under the control of Russia belong to a different country, okay, for Russia. Okay. Taiwan has never been independent since its return to China at the end of the World War II. Okay. It's still a sovereign part of piece of sovereign territory of China. Okay. Will China use force to take over Taiwan? Well, it depends on what Taiwan does. Okay. If the Taiwan authorities want to split the territory away from China, then China has no choice but to use force to stop it. Okay. It's something sacrosanct to the Chinese, just as the American Constitution is sacrosanct to the Americans. Okay. We cannot let Taiwan become independent. But peaceful unification is still and will be our preference. Okay. The current separation is political, resulting from a civil war before 1949. Okay. And if it's political unification, then we can take time. Okay. China will do whatever it can to promote economic integration, cultural connections, and also eventually political reunification. So I think the two situations are quite different, personally. Thank you.
Right. Would you like to answer that, John, or?
I'll just add this. I personally can't conflate Ukraine and Taiwan in the same conversation by virtue of geography, history, and politics and other things. They're two different cases. It's a tragedy on so many levels to see what has happened in Ukraine. Beyond imagination, to see tens of thousands die, a beautiful civilization destroyed, and the bullying and menacing of Vladimir Putin behind it in an attempt to strengthen his neighborhood. Now, it doesn't come as a surprise because Ukraine has been invaded before the events of February of 21. Crimea was part of that. Georgia was part of it in 2008 in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, Moldova and Transnistria. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. All in an attempt to ensure that the peripheral states around Russia do not become NATO members or EU affiliated. I think it's in the interest of China, as it is the United States, as it is the international community, to do everything possible to bring this devastation to an end. It either ends by way of catastrophic war, which this world cannot afford, nor does it desire, or a frozen conflict, which Vladimir Putin is expert at managing. And I suspect that we'll likely see a frozen conflict for a period before, number three, we get around to the real work of a diplomatic solution and resolution, which may seem impossible given what Kyiv is asking for and seeks at the negotiating table and what Moscow is asking for and seeks at the negotiating table. So it's a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, and it's disrupted Europe in ways that have made economics around energy and transportation and manufacturing. It's disrupted quality of life, the flow of refugees, and the loss of life has just been catastrophic. So it is in all of our interest to see what can be done, but and I'll end with this thought, on whether we like it or not, the people of the world have looked at the events in Ukraine, and they have said, and there goes Taiwan, that could be the next to receive similar treatment. So whether we like it or not, that is the perception among many people, and therefore the fear factor has risen about the possibility of conflict in this region. So no, they are not the same. They will be treated differently as things go forward, and it's in everyone's interest to work on a diplomatic resolution in Ukraine, because I believe that's the only way it's going to be brought to an end.
You know, we often ask the question, what is the impact of Ukraine on Taiwan, on China, you know, with regards to its thinking on Taiwan? And Professor Jia has just answered that question. But we don't often ask, what is the impact of the Ukraine war upon the thinking of the Taiwanese people themselves? I think recently there was a poll conducted in Taiwan which showed that Taiwanese are now, there are more of them opting for the status quo rather than independence, you know. Of course, China doesn't want status quo. China wants something else. But I think the idea of independence is something perhaps they've retreated a little from. But, you know, these things can wax and wane, these sentiments. So, but that's where we are at the moment. We have 5 minutes. I think Joe had his hand up, and I'll ask Joe to ask a question briefly and brief answers too. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. Chan, Ambassador Huntsman, Prof. Jia, good to see you all here again. Okay, so my question is this. I think we are all familiar that there is a lot of, call it prevailing narratives and conventional wisdoms in China and the US about what happened in the relationship and who is responsible. Yeah. But in the spirit of self-reflection, can I ask you, Ambassador Huntsman, to share your thoughts on what the United States might have done that have contributed to the downturn in relations, and Qingguo, your thoughts on what China might have done that contributed to the downturn in relations?
Well, there is an endless streak of grievances, whether they are trade-related, political-related, balloon-related, whatever the case might be. It seems that as soon as we stabilize somewhat the state of the bilateral relationship, something goes south, and things begin to unravel very, very quickly. So I could cite going way back, even before normalization of our bilateral relationship, how we were on opposite sides, whether in the Korean War, whether in the Vietnam War, whether the sloganeering and the propaganda during the Cultural Revolution. I mean, the list goes on and on and on that's been built up. And to each of those is a response from the United States, and oftentimes it's not taken well in China. Today, I would say that one of the biggest rubs is around ideology. So there is a very distinct perception in the United States that China has become more of a rigid nation state, that the level of pragmatism and flexibility that we have seen in decades past has moved to the dustbin of history. And therefore, we are locked in as rivals. I think there is a perception here. So the response by the United States is to relationship, as opposed to perceptions of one another and bad calculations, and that translates into bad policy. And I've seen that happen in other significant relationships in recent years, where that is a natural outgrowth. So yes, the list of grievances are complete in every conceivable category. And as I mentioned earlier, part of getting on a path to overall stability, not perfection. I think that's an aspiration that is not achievable in the many years ahead. But part of the path just to fundamental stability, to the point where we can get at a table and have negotiating sessions that are meaningful and perhaps yield something, is we have to address the issue of grievances and point scoring. So what do I mean by point scoring? Something happens to us, we do something back. We do something to China, they have to do something back. There is the great balance sheet in the sky that both sides keep, and you never want to be outdone by the other without a proper response. This is a very difficult cycle, I would say, to get out of. And I think it's one of the biggest challenges we face, is how do we move from the tit-for-tat point scoring, where each side has to rack up a score based upon the grievance that was presented, and get to more of a position of shared equilibrium. And it means perhaps we're going to have to swallow our pride just a little bit and say that peace and security of the region and the world are more important than point scoring and obsessing about grievances. I know that's a fundamentally simplistic way to look at things, but I think we're at a point in the bilateral relationship where we need to start building from the base fundamentals on up, and it starts there.
Qingguo?
There are many things I think we can reflect upon and improve ourselves. One of the things I think is that we haven't been able to tell a good story about China. Not effective, okay. We haven't been able to explain what's going on and communicate to the outside world effectively. And as a result, there is a lot of misunderstanding and maybe distrust about China. So probably we should be more forthcoming, more transparent, and also tell a better story about China, as President Xi has instructed. Thank you.
Well, we've come to the end of the session. Time's up. Now, we were tasked to find the balance amid geopolitical tensions. I'm not sure we found the balance. We were trying to look for hope throughout the session. And, sometimes we were optimistic, sometimes less optimistic. But I think this is a very difficult relationship going through a very difficult phase. And it's a good thing that now the two sides seem to be trying to find some balance, a landing point. And I'm very glad China reacted finally to accepting to meet, because I was wondering initially whether, with all the travels to China by American visitors, whether there would be a response. I think China was also trying to read the United States as a trust element, Is this for real? What do they mean? And now we hope there will be developments from these meetings. And from our part of the world, let me say to both Professor Jia and John, we really hope the two leaders do meet at APEC this year, because this is absolutely crucial for the peace and security for our part of the world. Well, it remains for me to thank Professor Qingguo and Ambassador Huntsman, and to thank the audience for listening and for your questions. Thank you.